Is your thinking really yours?
You believe it is.
You believe your thoughts are original, independent, chosen.
They are not. Most of what you think was never created by you. It was absorbed
From your environment, from repetition, from what was rewarded, from what was accepted.
You did not choose your beliefs. You inherited them, quietly,
Over time,
without questioning them.
and now,
You defend them.
as if they were yours. You argue for them,
You build your identity around them. You protect them.
not because they are true,
But because they are familiar, and familiarity feels like truth.
that is the problem.
You are not thinking. You are repeating patterns,
You never examined,
repeating ideas you never challenged, repeating conclusions you never tested.
and then you call it your opinion.
But it is not yours. It is a system built by influence, by fear, by approval, by comfort. And as long as you operate inside that system, you will never see clearly, because you are not looking at reality. You are looking through conditioning, and that distortion controls everything. What you believe, what you choose, what you avoid, what you pursue. You don't feel free because you are not free. You are structured by patterns you never built. And as long as you stay inside them, your life will feel limited, not because you lack potential, but because your thinking was never redesigned. So before you try to change your life, you must ask a different question. Not, what should I do next? But, who is doing the thinking? Because once you see that clearly, everything begins to shift. Now we go deeper. Part 1. You did not choose your thinking. You believe your thoughts are yours. You believe you created them. That they came from your intelligence, your experience, your personality. They did not. Most of your thinking was formed before you were aware of it, before you had the ability to question it, before you had the ability to reject it. It was installed through repetition, through exposure, through approval, through correction. You were not taught how to think. You were taught what to think, what is right, what is wrong, what is acceptable, what is dangerous, what is success, what is failure. And you accepted it, not because you evaluated it, but because you had to. That is how the mind develops. It adopts before it analyzes. It absorbs before it questions. And by the time you become capable of questioning, the system is already built, already running, already shaping your perception. That is why your thoughts feel natural, because they are familiar, not because they are true. Familiarity is the most powerful form of conditioning. You repeat something long enough, and it becomes invisible. You no longer see it as an idea. You see it as reality. That is the shift. An idea becomes a belief. A belief becomes a lens, and a lens becomes your world. You are no longer thinking about the belief. You are thinking through it. That is why it is so difficult to detect, because it does not appear as something separate. It appears as you. You say, this is how I see things. This is just who I am. This is how the world works. But you never stop to ask, where did this come from? Who gave me this framework? Why do I believe this is true? Because questioning your own thinking creates instability. And the mind avoids instability. It prefers coherence, even if that coherence is false. So it protects what it already knows. It defends it. It justifies it. It builds identity around it. And once identity is attached, change becomes threatening. Because now you are not just questioning an idea, you are questioning yourself. That is why most people never update their thinking. Not because they lack intelligence, but because their identity is built on their beliefs. And removing a belief feels like losing a part of yourself. So you stay with it, even when it limits you, even when it distorts reality, even when it creates unnecessary suffering. You stay with it because it feels like you. That is the illusion. You confuse familiarity with truth. You confuse repetition with understanding. You confuse identity with accuracy.
But none of those are reliable.
Because they were not built consciously. They were built passively, and passive structures create active limitations. They define what you see, what you ignore, what you believe is possible, what you believe is not. They shape your decisions before you even realize you are making them. That is how powerful they are. You think you are choosing, but most of the time, you are selecting within a predefined structure, a structure you did not design, a structure you never examined, a structure you rarely question. That is why your life feels constrained, not because the world is limited, but because your perception is. You cannot act beyond what you can see, and you cannot see beyond your structure. So the limitation is not external, it is internal. And it is invisible. That is the most dangerous kind, because you do not fight it, you obey it. You call it logic, you call it reality, you call it common sense, but often it is just repetition, repeated long enough to feel unquestionable. So the first realization is not comfortable. It is destabilizing. Your thinking is not as original as you believed, not as independent, not as chosen. It is structured, and that structure is not entirely yours. That is where awareness begins, not with control, not with clarity, but with doubt. Doubt about your own thinking, doubt about what you assume is true, doubt about what you never questioned. Because without that doubt, nothing changes. And with that doubt, everything becomes possible. Now we go deeper, because once you see that your thinking was formed, you must also see what is still shaping it. Right now, every day. Without your awareness. Part 2. Your thinking is still being shaped right now. You think your thinking is complete, stable, defined. It is not. It is still being shaped, right now, every day. Without your awareness, you are not only repeating past patterns, you are continuously updating them through what you consume, what you watch, what you listen to, what you agree with, what you avoid. Every input enters your system, and most of it is not filtered. You scroll. You observe, you react, and your mind adjusts quietly, subtly, constantly. That is how modern conditioning works, not through force, through exposure, repetition, volume. You are not told what to believe. You are shown what to repeat, over and over again, until it feels normal. Until it feels obvious, until it feels like truth. This is why your thinking shifts so easily. Not because you are weak, but because your system is open. Open to influence, open to noise, open to suggestion. Without structure, everything enters, and whatever enters repeatedly becomes dominant. That is the rule. The mind does not prioritize truth. It prioritizes frequency. What appears most often feels most real. What is repeated most feels most correct. So your thinking becomes a reflection of what you are exposed to, not what you consciously chose. That is why two people can live in the same world and see completely different realities. Because they are not seeing the world. They are seeing their inputs, their filters, their structure. And most people never question their inputs. They question conclusions. They question outcomes, but not the source. Not what is feeding the system. That is the mistake. Because if the input is unstructured, the output will be unstable, no matter how intelligent you are, no matter how motivated you feel, no matter how disciplined you try to be. Unstructured input creates inconsistent thinking, and inconsistent thinking creates inconsistent action. That is why you feel different, depending on what you consume. One moment you feel focused, another moment you feel lost. One moment you feel confident, another moment you doubt everything. This is not randomness, it is influence. Your system is reacting to whatever it absorbed. That is why control feels impossible. Because you are trying to control outcomes without controlling inputs. That never works. You cannot think clearly with chaotic input. You cannot act consistently with unstable perception. You cannot build direction while constantly shifting perspective. So the problem is not your ability to think. It is your environment of thinking. You are inside a stream of influence, and you are not filtering it. That means your thinking is always moving, always adjusting, always reacting, never stabilizing. And a mind that never stabilizes cannot build anything meaningful. Because building requires consistency. Consistency requires clarity. Clarity requires structure. And structure begins with what you allow into your system. So the real question is not, how do I think better? The real question is, what is shaping my thinking right now? Because until you control that, your thinking will never be yours. It will always be influenced, always adjusted, always dependent. And that means your life will never be fully yours either. Now we go deeper, because once you see that your thinking is being shaped, you must understand why you keep accepting that influence without resistance. Part 3. You accept influence because it feels safe. You think you are influenced because the world is powerful. That is only part of the truth. You are influenced because you accept it, and you accept it because it feels safe. Independent thinking is not natural. It is difficult. It creates friction. It creates conflict. It creates isolation. When you question what everyone accepts, you separate yourself from agreement, from approval, from comfort. Most people do not want that. They want alignment. They want to belong. They want to feel included, so they adjust. Not consciously, but structurally. They soften their questions. They reduce their resistance. They avoid challenging ideas that might create tension. And slowly, they stop thinking independently. Not because they cannot, but because they choose not to. Because thinking independently comes with a cost. The cost of standing alone. The cost of uncertainty. The cost of not having immediate validation. And the human system is designed to avoid those costs. It prefers safety over truth. It prefers agreement over accuracy. It prefers comfort over clarity. So it accepts influence, even when that influence is shallow, even when it is inconsistent, even when it contradicts itself. Because consistency is not the priority. Safety is. This is why your thinking adapts so easily. You see a dominant idea. You feel its pressure. You feel its presence. And your system adjusts to reduce tension. You begin to agree, or at least, you stop questioning. That is enough, because once questioning stops, influence completes its work. You don't need to fully believe something for it to shape you. You only need to stop resisting it. And most people stop resisting quickly, because resistance is uncomfortable. It requires attention. It requires energy. It requires clarity. Without structure, you do not have the strength to resist. So you accept. You absorb. You repeat. And over time, what you once observed becomes what you believe. That is how influence becomes identity. That is how repetition becomes truth. That is how external ideas become internal conviction. And once that happens, you defend them. You protect them. You argue for them, not because they are correct, but because they are yours now, or at least, they feel like they are. That is the illusion. You are defending what you once absorbed without questioning. You are protecting what you never chose consciously. And because of that, your thinking becomes closed, not open, not flexible, not exploratory, but fixed, rigid, attached. And once attachment appears, clarity disappears. Because you are no longer looking for truth. You are protecting identity. That is why most people cannot think clearly. Not because they lack intelligence, but because they are attached to what they believe. And attachment blocks revision.
It blocks correction. It blocks growth. So even when they encounter better ideas, they resist them. Not logically, structurally, because change would require releasing what feels like self. That is why transformation is rare. It requires detachment. Detachment from belief. Detachment from identity. Detachment from what feels certain. Without that detachment, you remain inside the same system, the same thinking, the same patterns, the same limitations. So the issue is not influence alone. It is your relationship to influence. You do not filter it. You do not challenge it. You do not resist it. You accept it. Because it is easier. Because it is safer. Because it is familiar. And that is why your thinking remains unexamined. And unexamined thinking creates a limited life. Now the next step is not just awareness, it is separation. Because once you understand how influence enters and why you accept it, you must decide what you are willing to reject. That is where real structure begins. That is where thinking becomes yours. And that is where we go next. Part 4. You take control by rebuilding your thinking. You don't take control of your thinking by improving it. You take control by rebuilding it. Improvement assumes the system is already yours. It is not. So, adding more information does nothing. More ideas, more content, more opinions. That only increases noise, and noise weakens clarity. The problem is not lack of knowledge. It is lack of structure. So the first step is not addition. It is removal. You must remove what you did not choose. Not everything, but enough. To see clearly, you question your beliefs, not to doubt everything blindly, but to identify what is actually yours. You ask, did I choose this, or did I absorb it? That question alone begins separation. And separation creates space. Space to see, space to think, space to decide. Without space, there is no control, only reaction. So you remove. You reduce. You simplify your inputs, because a clear mind cannot exist in a noisy system. You limit what enters, what you consume, what you repeat, what you allow to influence you. This is not restriction. This is design, because whatever you repeat becomes structure. So you choose repetition carefully. You expose your mind to what strengthens it, not what stimulates it. You replace random input with intentional input. That is how thinking stabilizes. Then you define your standards, not general standards, not vague ideas, clear ones. What matters? What does not? What you value, what you reject. This becomes your filter, your internal system. Now, when new ideas appear, you don't absorb them blindly. You test them against your structure. If they align, you integrate them. If they don't, you reject them. That is control, not isolation, not ignorance. Selective integration. That is how thinking becomes yours. Not by blocking the world, but by filtering it. And once your system is clear, your thinking changes. Not dramatically, but consistently. You stop reacting. You start evaluating. You stop copying. You start selecting. You stop repeating. You start building. That is the shift. From influence to authorship. From absorption to design. From noise to clarity. And once that shift happens, everything else follows. Your decisions become sharper. Your direction becomes stable. Your identity becomes defined, not by what you consumed, but by what you chose. That is when thinking becomes yours. Not perfectly, but intentionally. And that is enough. Because intentional thinking creates intentional life. And that is where real control begins. Part 5. Clarity comes from separation, not information. You think you need more information, more knowledge, more content. You don't. You need separation.
Because your problem is not ignorance, it is overload. Too many inputs, too many ideas, too many influences, and without structure, all of it mixes together, creating confusion, not clarity. Clarity is not found in more information. It is found in less noise. You remove what is unnecessary. You reduce what is distracting. You eliminate what does not align. That is how clarity appears. Not all at once, but gradually. The more you remove, the more you see. The more you filter, the more you understand. And once clarity begins, your thinking stabilizes because it is no longer reacting to everything. It is aligned with something. Something chosen, something defined, something yours. That is the difference. Information fills the mind. Structure organizes it. Without structure, more information creates confusion. With structure, less information creates clarity. So stop adding, start removing. That is where clarity begins. Part 6. You don't need better thoughts. You need a better system. You are trying to think better. That is the wrong approach. Better thinking does not come from effort. It comes from structure. A weak system creates weak thinking, no matter how hard you try. A strong system creates clear thinking, even when you are not trying. That is the difference. So stop focusing on thoughts. Focus on the system behind them. What you consume, what you repeat, what you allow, what you reject. That is your real thinking process. Not the thoughts themselves, but the structure that produces them. When that structure is clear, your thinking improves automatically, not because you forced it, but because it became inevitable. That is how real change works. Not through intensity, but through design. Not through motivation, but through system. Ending. If this way of thinking changes how you see your mind, if you prefer structure over influence, clarity over noise, and design over repetition, then stay with this channel. Subscribe and like to continue building this way of thinking, because your life will not change. When you think differently once, it changes. When your structure changes permanently, design your mind, structure your life.